The awareness of the phenomenon of quote-unquote acausal connections or quote-unquote simultaneous occurrences, although unrecognized by the mainstream academia, is a persistent hallmark of a day and age. If it's not recognized as such publicly, it all the more piques the interests of myriads of people in their private lives and, as is customary these days for quote-unquote suppressed issues, it became locus classicus online. Some people are even convinced it got current President of United States of America into office. There are strong reasons for this, and I call synchronicity a phenomenon because I affirm its existence, which is hard to deny regardless of apparently being scientifically inexplicable. In this analysis, we'll offer few insights about what synchronicity might be. However, in contrast to most treatments of this phenomenon, from Carl Gustav Jung's preliminary work down to plethora of the New Age quote-unquote spiritual textbooks and manuals, ending up with alt-right chaos magic inauguration of their president of choice, the inference you'll find below are intended to show that the question of synchronicity could be in fact a rather sinister affair. The premonition of this is already apparent in the very term Jung employed to define it: acausal connection. This term, upon which we have already dwelled elsewhere, is brimming with layers of meaning, although on closer logical scrutiny it is, in its core, quite meaningless. Jung chose it because he irrevocably rejected the notion that causality can provide a basis for an account of meaningful coincidence between the reality of man's inner being and the world he's immersed in. This decision implies the total, utter, and irrevocable rejection of any kind of intellectual, and this means metaphysical and or theological approach to the issue, or, as would seem more appropriate, fact of correspondence of what is inside to that which is outside. Let us note in advance that the main reason for this on ontological level was Jung's restricted understanding of the causality itself. The main flaw in it, to use a very generous qualification, is that it is based on the modern epistemology taken from the specific understanding of natural sciences with the added spin of the supposed new horizons opened by new physics, so-called, whose advent he witnessed in his time. The notion that was seemingly opening the skies above his head, while in fact it was dissolving the ground beneath his feet. So if we call Jung's work on synchronicity groundbreaking, reader is advised not to understand this as compliment. On the contrary, for moderately keen observer of contemporary fringe movements, it is becoming increasingly obvious that breaking of the ground was a clear invitation to perform the twofold descent, understood by some of them as an ascent. It is now fairly simple to believe that you can change the world by the willful act of imagination and call it a quote-unquote reality tunnel, in which meaningful coincidences abound to such a degree that they cease to be coincidences. It is also very simple to believe that the world is being re-enchanted because your reality tunnel seems by its very nature to be the world itself. Finally, it is now simple to believe that your research, activism, personal adventure, or political project signify the advent of the new age, where inside will be reconciled with the outside on the higher ground. Yet, this is an illusion. Breaking of the ground, and we'll attempt to show that synchronicity is precisely the omen of this coming to pass, can get you only below it. The reconciliation doesn't happen on the higher ground, but on the ever lower level of erosion of both mental and social, even natural stability. It is the descent into madness reconciled with the fall into chaos. That is, the illusion that progressively becomes real. The first part of the analysis will be devoted to outlining the genesis of the synchronicity in modern thought and the contemporary examples of it becoming an epistemology and even ideology of sorts for fringe movements and individuals who nevertheless exercise considerable influence precisely and paradoxically by being fringe. In the second part, we'll attempt to show that synchronicity is an inversion of traditional metaphysical idea of correspondences both in the world of nature and one's life path, caused by the activity of ultimate causality of God and intermediary causality of non-material principles, i.e., that meaning is brought about precisely by that which modern thought seeks to reject, an eternal causal activity of what could be summarized up in the medieval notion of transcendentalia, the one, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Or, to put it in the terms most irritating to cynical mind, it is caused by the activity of eternal love. Synchronicity is a chain of events connected in observer's mind by congenial meaning that is nevertheless disclosed by something from the outside world. For example, if I rise in the morning thinking about a certain number, say 9, walk to the kitchen and observe 9 cups in the dishwasher, then walk out in the street and at exactly 9 o'clock receive the reminder that my little cousin is celebrating 9th birthday, we can say that I might be in the presence of synchronicity event. If I proceed to read in the evening and realize that the question that was bothering me could have been answered on the page 9 of the book, then I am all the more reinforced in this belief, because the chain of coincidences was fulfilled by the meaningful answer to a question. This occurrence is not so rare as one might think, and it provoked some modern thinkers to think it indicates to something modernity vulgaris finally renounced in the mid to late 19th century, the existence of meaningful structure that encompasses and somehow unites one's life with the world at large. Not that this was something new. The doctrines of traditional metaphysics already addressed this implicitly or explicitly, not as curiosity or strange premonition of something hidden, but as a rather second-rate fact in the great scheme of creation. On the other hand, those few modern thinkers that quote-unquote broke the ground worked on the assumption that their ancient and medieval predecessors just gave an imperfect explanation of the phenomenon and took to the task to explain it in the modern terms. What followed from this typical mistake of modern philosophy was not merely negative result, i.e., outright denial of the existence of meaningful connections uniting the soul and the world, but a positive inversion, i.e., appropriating the phenomenon in the terms of their own presuppositions, which in fact cannot affirm its existence, let alone comprehend it, and thus distorted its image into its very opposite. They created a counterfeit, an illusion that is real, a meaning stemming from meaningless. The motive for this was initially a fairly valid one. Quote, "Here it is very unlikely that the most important thing in the world, namely the curse of a man's life, purchased at the price of so much activity, trouble, and suffering, should obtain only the other half of its guidance, namely the part coming from without, simply and solely from the hand of a reality, of really blind chance, that is absolutely nothing in itself and dispenses with all direction and order." End quote. Schopenhauer from Transcendent Speculation on Apparent Design in the Fate of the Individual, essay from his Parerga and Paralipomena, 2-volume book of his short philosophical essays. The desire to find meaning in one's own life is fairly natural, isn't it? Well, until recently it was. However, this urge to reach the universal order, taking as the starting point one's own needs and urges, however strong and pure they might be, and not the other way around, is precisely the essential characteristics of what in Jung's hands later became known as synchronicity. Since then, things went further downwards, until the moment when this quote-unquote natural desire provoked the whole plethora of chaotic young people to invoke their own god to inaugurate their presidential candidate into office. But there were some preliminary changes in the mindset of our civilization that made this finally possible. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the first among modern philosophers who wrote about the problem that later became known as synchronicity, and his essay Transcendent Speculation on Apparent Design in the Fate of the Individual was recognized by Jung as a critical starting point for his own speculation. He gives two analogies that serve to illustrate the underlying purposefulness of events that are seemingly accidental. We'll use the first one as the starting point for our discussion of synchronicity. Quote, Schopenhauer: accidental means the concurrence in time of that which is causally not connected. But nothing is absolutely accidental. On the contrary, even the most accidental is only something necessary that has come to us on a more distant path, since the definite causes lying high up in the causal chain have long ago necessarily determined that something was bound to occur precisely at this moment, and therefore simultaneously with something else. Thus every event is the particular link in a chain of causes and effects which proceeds in the direction of time. But in virtue of space, there are numberless such chains side by side, yet they are not entirely foreign to one another and without any interconnection. On the contrary, they are intertwined in many ways. For instance, many causes now operating simultaneously, each of which produces a different effect, have sprung from a common cause higher up and are therefore related to one another as great-grandchildren are to their great-grandfather. On the other hand, a particular effect occurring now often requires the coincidence of many different causes which, each as a link in its own chain, have come to us from the past. Accordingly, all those causal chains that move in the direction of time now form a large, common, much interwoven net, which with its whole breadth likewise moves forward in the direction of time and constitutes the course of the world. Now, if we represent those individual causal chains by meridians that would lie in the direction of time, then that which is simultaneous and for this reason does not stand in direct causal connection can be everywhere indicated by parallel circles. Now, although all things situated under the same parallel circle do not directly depend on one another, they nevertheless stand indirectly in some connection, though remote, by virtue of the interlacing of the whole net, or of the totality of all causes and effects that roll along in the direction of time. Their present coexistence is therefore necessary, and on this rests the accidental coincidence of all the conditions of an event that is necessary in a higher sense, the happening of that which fate has willed. To this is due, for example, the fact that when in consequence of the migration of the German tribes, Europe was overrun with barbarism, the finest masterpieces of Greek sculpture, the Laocoon, the Vatican Apollo, and others, disappeared at once, as if by trapdoor, by finding their way down into the bowels of the earth, there to wait unharmed for 1,000 years a milder, nobler era that would understand and appreciate the arts. When that time finally arrived, at the end of the 15th century under Pope Julius II, those masterpieces reappeared as the well-preserved specimens of art and the true type of the human form." End quote. Herein, Schopenhauer expresses his conviction in the existence of unity of the world, which is truly a source of any substantial meaning both in individual human life and his environment. In that sense, Schopenhauer is still to an extent connected to the traditional notion of metaphysical principles situated above transient world of change and chance, both in the cosmological outer and psychological inner sense. The meaningful coincidence we call human fate comes from the activity of the higher cause, which is not apparent to us. So, if we try to divine the meaning from the plethora of apparent causes of some meaningful situation, they appear to us completely accidental. Thence comes the sense of wonder and foreboding about meaningful occurrences that shape one's life from the outside, although, if taken in themselves, they display no apparent meaning. The result is that we have fairly justified intuition that the world somehow conspired to bring about circumstances which set the individual on the path that is unique for him. However, while this would be very close to the understanding of traditional metaphysics, Schopenhauer diverges in the radically different direction. Instead of taking the higher causes to be completely different order than human or natural faculty, he employs his Kantian doctrine of transcendental idealism. Namely, Schopenhauer's own philosophy is based on Kantian assumption that phenomena possess only empirical reality while they retain transcendental ideality. This means that things we experience in the spatial temporal world are phenomena and not things in themselves. Their essential structure, that is, the fact that they are given in the forms of space and time and are comprehended in the category of causality, the only one of 12 Kantian categories of pure reason Schopenhauer retains, is built by conscious subject. This subject is not an individual human being, but pure subjectivity as a source of conceptual and material structure of the world, and can be summed up as pure will and reason. The will, in Schopenhauer's eyes, is not originally conscious but blind striving towards being, which evolves in the higher forms that finally, in the case of human being, achieve the faculty of mind, enabling to reflect and produce representations, i.e. concepts and conceptual images, thus making the cosmological will self-conscious. We'll not dwell deeply into Schopenhauer's pessimist metaphysics, but note only few things that are highly important for our subject. This philosophy is just one among the systems of modernity, trying in a roundabout way to prove that the world is in fact a creation of consciousness. Schopenhauer's more successful contemporaries, summed under the umbrella term of classical German idealism, strive to do the same. This consciousness is, putting it as simplified as possible, a self-consciousness of human being, raised to the level of both the main metaphysical principle and the ultimately certain principle of knowledge. Therefore, modern philosophy of consciousness, or transcendental philosophy, can, with high degree of accuracy, be named as the philosophy of pure ego. It starts from the fact of the absolute evidence of I that reflects upon itself and takes this as a self-evident truth upon which it can build everything else. In this way, all phenomena willy-nilly start to revolve around metaphysical I, and all notions of traditional metaphysics and theology are being explained as imperfect premonitions of this fact. So the primal cause, in Schopenhauer's view, is not God, as tradition would have it, but transcendental will, which resides in all things but is understood in anthropomorphic terms because no other terms exist. If now we turn to current affairs, we can detect the faint reflection of the same idea in the notion of synchronistic reality tunnel employed by plebeian chaos magicians from internet image boards. In Richard Spencer's words, quote, "But even though we always took Trump seriously, there was still a moment of unreality, or perhaps too painfully intense reality, when the state of Pennsylvania was called for Donald Trump. The moment when we knew Keck had smiled upon us, that meme magic was real, and though these terms are used half-jokingly, they represent something truly important, the victory of will. We willed Donald Trump into office, made his dream into reality." Close quote. To recap, the idea is that plethora of alt-right aficionados willed Donald Trump into office by invoking the Egyptian god of chaos. The quote-unquote proof of this was precisely the synchronicity. To make a long story short, this is how the idea dawned on 4chan posters. Quote, "The precise origins of Pepe the Frog are, like all image board memes, obscure and unimportant. All you really need to know is that sometime around 2010, a sad-looking cartoon frog began to trend among posters on 4chan.org and similar underground image boards. Shortly after, the age-old piece of online vernacular used to express laughter, namely lol, laughing out loud, fell out of favor on these sites. In its place, a new slang term of synonymous meaning rose to common use, namely kek. The origins of this trend are much more important. It comes from an odd technicality involving the Korean language and the popular video game World of Warcraft. One last thing you need to understand about image board culture is dubs. Every post on 4chan and similar venues comes with an 8-digit numerical stamp. This number represents that post's entry position in the entire posting lineage of the image board. With the amount of traffic these sites get, the last couple digits of this number are essentially a random roll. When a poster gets repeated digits, it's called dubs, trips, quads, and so on. Since a poster can't know their post number until after they have submitted the post, it's common for people to bet the contents of their messages on the occurrence of repeating digits. When that endeavor proves successful, a get has been made and the stroke of luck is celebrated. Out of this practice, a strange phenomenon began to take place on poll discussion threads associated with Trump, displayed noticeably frequent gets. It wasn't long before all of these seemingly random elements discussed so far became irreparably tied together within image board culture. 1. Pepe the Frog, now Paul's unofficial mascot. 2. Donald Trump, Paul's overwhelming candidate of choice. 3. Repeating digit post numbers, or gets. And 4. Kek, used as an expression of delight, particular in a response to Trump's trolling of the establishment, as well as in the reaction to unlikely gets in general. And a god was born. Unquote. If we put this in Schopenhauerian terms, there should have been a higher cause that prompted the accidental correspondences to bring about the prediction of Trump's victory. However, this is not how chaos magicians see it. The event was brought about by their will, i.e., it was a horizontal activity of the individual wills and not a vertical activity of transcendental cause acting upon them. The only exception to this rule breaking all other rules, is their firm conviction that they invoked something from below to aid them in their labors. Let us keep this in mind for later. This indicates to a significant change of perspective we'll provisionally define as postmodern one. The principle of I is not anymore something at the same time common to all and different from all, but is what it is in everyday living, a series of divided indivisibles or individuums. The world-building ego is not anymore a singular entity underlying all, but myriad of separated and in their view quite absolute wills creating the world or worlds in their own image or images. If this seems absurd, because there is after all only one world, well, it is. But it is real nevertheless. From this perspective, Schopenhauer's notions of the web of causality descending from one original cause and intersecting at certain points to create simultaneous effects cannot explain anything. There is no hierarchy of causes, because every conscious node in the network is equally significant or insignificant for the whole. To be more exact, there is no whole, because the only reality is the projection of the imagination of the individuum numerically distinct from other individuum, which is also projecting its imagination and will. In this sense, the wholeness would be only an aggregate or sum total of individual projections, in itself always only potential, ever-changing kaleidoscope that constantly gets constructed and deconstructing depending on the perspective of the observer. Strangely enough, this kind of web on synchronistic events, differing from Schopenhauer's analogy by virtue of its horizontality, would quite well describe the World Wide Web in the most anarchic sense of the total digital freedom and the infinite flow of information where everything is connected with everything else, with no hierarchy in the strength of various infinite connections. The Internet is therefore a very apt medium for synchronicity because it is based on the infinite nexus of meaningful connections that are nevertheless meaningless if taken as a whole, by virtue of no existing unifying principle. It is no wonder that fringe movements as alt-right, especially in its fundamental Internet incarnation, thrive on synchronicities as explanatory and ideological model. Keck, the god of chaos, truly rules this reality tunnel, because it is his appropriate domain. The infinite flow of by definition meaningful pieces of information, always finally reduced to virus-like simplicity of memes, could very well be understood as a huge web of synchronicity itself, a web where everything is simultaneous and meaningful in itself, but as a whole completely meaningless. This brings us to the notion of acausal and Carl Gustav Jung's appropriation and critique of Schopenhauer's flawed but still not yet quite as sinister notion of meaningful correspondences. The second Schopenhauer's analogy provides us with premonition of where both the nature of phenomenon of meaningful correspondences and the attempts to explain and exploit it will divulge in the late 20th century. Quote from Schopenhauer. A second analogy that from an entirely different angle can help towards an indirect understanding of the transcendental fatalism we have been considering is given by the dream, to which life generally bears a resemblance that has long been recognized and often expressed, so much so that even Kant's transcendental idealism may be conceived as the clearest exposition of this dreamlike nature of our conscious existence. Indeed, it is this analogy with the dream which enables us to observe, although again only remotely and obscurely, how the mysterious power governing and controlling the external events that affects us with a view to their purpose for us might yet have its root in the depths of our own unfathomable nature. Thus, even in the dream, circumstances, by pure chance, coincide and there become the motives of our actions, circumstances that are external to and independent of us, and indeed often abhorrent. But yet there is between them a mysterious and appropriate connection, since a hidden power that is obeyed by all the incidents in the dream controls and arranges even these circumstances, and indeed solely with reference to us. But the strangest thing of all is that this power can ultimately be none other than our own will, yet from a point of view that does not enter our dreaming consciousness. And so it happens that the events in a dream often turn out quite contrary to our wishes therein, cause us astonishment, annoyance, and even mortal terror, without a fate that we secretly direct, coming to our rescue. In the same way, we eagerly ask about something and receive an answer whereat we are astonished, or again, we ourselves are asked, say in examination, and are incapable of finding an answer, whereupon another, to our shame, gives a perfect answer, whereas in the one case, as in the other, the answer can always come only from our own resources. Now, might it not be possible for fate in real life, and for that systematic planning which perhaps everyone comes to know from an observation of his own life, to be analogous to the position set forth in the dream? It sometimes happens that we have devised and enthusiastically adopted a plan from which it is evident that it was by no means suited to our true welfare, yet while we are eagerly pursuing it, we experience against it a conspiracy of fate, which sets in motion all its machinery to defeat it. In this way, fate finally thrusts us back against our own will onto the path that is truly suited to us. Unquote. Here Schopenhauer, with his customary clarity, displays both the truth and the illusion of modern notion of what became known as synchronicity. He is obliged to observe the strict necessity inherent in the modern notion of causality, where cause and effect are standing in the irreversible relation of succession. There is not any more a clear notion of effect simultaneously proceeding from, remaining in, and returning to the cause, as we shall see was the case in traditional doctrine of meaningful correspondences. But nevertheless, the nexus cannot be conceived as anything but causal. This means that the hand of fate is indeed ever stronger and wiser than our individual wills. On the other hand, the simile of a dream is the clear step in the direction that will, as I would argue, end up in what we have now with the New Age, chaos magic, and finally chaos politics. As the will of fate is congenial to us in the sense that it can be understood only in analogy to us, we who are, according to Schopenhauer, its highest manifestation in nature, it can only be conceived as an eternal dream master, the progenitor of the great dream of life, inside of which all our individual dreams play out. This is illusion as reality. Schopenhauer named it Maya in accordance with his pioneering interpretation of Upanishad, he spliced to Kant's transcendental idealism. His connection to traditional notions is still apparent in his focus not on magical correspondences, which are primarily of utilitarian interest, but on the fate as a moral category. As he considers the individual man to be the only subject of true meaning in history, in contrast to societies and great historical events, something his arch-enemy Hegel saw from completely opposite direction, the meaning of meaningful correspondences is to be understood as leading an individual to a kind of moral fulfillment that finds its ultimate goal in the resignation of the will and extinguishing of the desire to exist, in Schopenhauer's understanding of Buddhist nirvana, which he quotes to all true mysticism and sainthood. As flawed and quite extravagant his notion might appear, its logical structure is a faint reflection of traditional doctrine on meaning of life in general, putting the freedom of the will and its communication with the higher realm in the sphere of good and evil. However, can there be any good and evil in dream, apart from waking up? He would argue no. Those who came after him pushed this ominous idea further by stating there is in fact no possibility of waking up. The idea that meaningful correspondences might not be caused at all dawned on Carl Gustav Jung, who explicitly states that Schopenhauer's essay was his lifelong inspiration in this regard. Where he diverges from his teacher is the notion that causal nexus is necessary for explanation. Quote from Jung. The philosophical principle that underlies our conception of natural law is causality. But if the connection between cause and effects turn out to be only statistically valid and only relatively true, then the causal principle is only of relative use for explaining natural processes and therefore presupposes the existence of one or more other factors which would be necessary for an explanation. This is as much as to say that the connection of events may in certain circumstances be other than causal, and requires another principle of explanation. End quote, Carl Gustav Jung, essay Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. In his rejection of causality, Jung relays on the notion of that the new physics demonstrated, quote unquote, that natural laws are merely statistical truth. This later became the commonplace of New Age, where quantum physics supposedly proves that matter is unreal and that this groundbreaking insight will somehow put humanity on the way downwards towards the realm of spirit, conceived as more subtle and original form of quote-unquote intelligent matter. The notion is a classical case of what René Guénon would roughly at the time Jung wrote this essay called counterfeit, where the formal notion of metaphysical truth is retained while its fundamental meaning expressed in the simple term of direction is inverted. In this way, the counterfeit becomes the illusion endowed with the power of exercising an actual operation on the psyche and the world, because it doesn't flatly deny its content, but corrupts it. The counterfeit doesn't devalue an idea, as a reasonable criminal wouldn't devalue the money he counterfeits, but uses it to replace the real thing. Fate, meaning, and meaningful correspondences are retained, but they are now supposed to come from the opposite source, from the eternal one. Not from upwards, but from downwards. It is therefore all the more interesting that by altogether rejecting the modern notion of causality, Jung doesn't simply reattach to traditional doctrine of it, but takes as the only appropriate explanatory model an ultimate modern technique of mathematical divination: statistics. The acausal connection, that is, temporal correspondence of simultaneous events connected by meaning, is to be demonstrated in the terms of quantity by means of the most soulless among the mathematical disciplines of calculating its probability. There's no more use of invoking the meaningful cause to explain the meaning. The sphere of research and the origin of the phenomenon must be the unmeaning itself. Quote, now, there is in our experience an immeasurably wide field whose existence forms, as it were, the counterbalance to the domain of causality. This is the world of chance, where a chance event seems causally unconnected with the coinciding fact. End quote. In Jung's optics, there is no possibility of anything in the world existing before the chance, while at the same time he tries to demonstrate precisely that chance itself is an illusion. This is something that was lost to him and to more morally minded admirers of his. But sinister ones never miss this opportunity. They flatly declare that the origin of the meaning is the great unmeaning itself, the chaos and its progeny. Jung had arranged all the pieces on the postmodern Warhammer gaming board ingeniously. Quote, in man's original view of the world, as we find it among primitives, space and time have a very precarious existence. They become fixed concepts only in the course of his mental development, thanks largely to the introduction of measurement. In themselves, space and time consists of nothing. They are hypostatized concepts born of the discriminating activity of the conscious mind, and they form the indispensable coordinates for describing the behavior of bodies in motion. They are therefore essentially psychic in origin, which is probably the reason that impelled Kant to regard them as a priori categories. Unquote. Just a note, Jung is wrong here. In Kant, time and space are a priori intuitions, not categories. That's a different thing. It's all there. Transcendental idealism, an evolutionary principle of spontaneous, primitive, and civilized modern, the dichotomy of noble savage with access to more original experience of the world and self-conscious but neurotic gentleman. The time is a pure form of intuition, but not transcendental, i.e. singular and all-encompassing subjective principle, but creation of individual, historically developed psyche founded in biological evolution. After all, quote, but a chance can only be a demonstrable quantity. A transcendental cause is a contradiction in terms, because anything transcendental cannot by definition be demonstrated. End quote. This is a clear statement of ultimate discrepancy and contradiction in terms of knowledge that seeks only material causes that can be demonstrated, while on the other hand grasps at statistics to break the ground, as it were, on which they rest in order to divine the meaning emerging through the cracks of this earthy mud and cosmic void we call the world. When this passionate academic jargon is set aside, it appears as pathetic and desperate as the invocation of an Egyptian god of chaos by the legion of 4 and 8 dwelling kids. To stick to the crudeness of it, the appropriate metaphor would be an attempt of having sexual intercourse while denying the very possibility of penetration. Indicates to quite a lot of humping and quite a bit of noise, but little in the terms of satisfying result. Jung's proposition was that unconscious archetypes bring meaning at the expense of the individual's ego, but does not proceed to explain how unconscious bridges the gap between I and the world. He saw the possible solution of the problem in modern scientific magic, i.e. in Rhine's experiments with extrasensory perception. This clearly demonstrates that now the synchronicity is not anymore concerned with good and evil, but with its application in order to fulfill the needs of the I, be it mental health or action at distance. In any case, I is not anymore a single transcendental principle, but accidental infinity of egos projecting their will and imagination into the world, sometimes changing it in still mysterious way. While it would be unfair towards Jung to consider his motives as introduction of chaos principle into the world for the sakes of what the chaos is only good for, that is, creating more chaos, this is quite a logical conclusion of his unconscious counterfeiting operation. In this respect, the reader can consult our analysis of Order of the Nine Angles metaphysics, where one can witness how Jungian approach served to build entirely consistent system of modern Satanism. What puts Jung's groundbreaking discovery squarely in the postmodern mold of the further dissolution of traditional teaching that could help one to find one's primarily moral bearing in the world is his idea of experimental quantifying of synchronicity for the purpose of becoming able to control it. This is only implied, but nevertheless necessary, causally necessary, I wonder, consequence of his approach, exemplified by his interest in extrasensory perception and divination techniques. The deep psychology approach furthermore distorts the ancient symbols Jung and his adherents are all too happy to explore, by putting them in the sphere of amorphous unconscious psyche, whereas they are based on strict doctrines developed on the assumption that our world is ultimately caused and held in existence by causality which infinitely transcends anything modern science, in whichever direction it focuses, can comprehend. The idea that teachings of Platonists like Plotinus or Proclo or church fathers, for example, are product of the working of unconsciousness of quote-unquote primitive mind would be laughable if it wasn't so ominous. However, those teachings, as we shall attempt to demonstrate in more detail in the second part of the analysis, are completely inappropriate for creating the chaos magic presidential election, and hence can only be aped in a more or less sinister way. The main reason for this, to say in advance, is the complete impossibility of higher, and this strictly means immaterial causes, to be manipulated by those who came into existence by their activity. Traditional metaphysics is the set of doctrines from the world where man was perhaps the crown of creation, but in no way, shape or form could he conceive himself as its creator. This is something almost no one wants to hear now, let alone those who invoke the below, which is in the eyes of the deluded something that indeed can be manipulated and put to use, be it in revolutionary or magical practice, or indeed combination thereof, as the leader of alt-right himself half ironically stated. So things being that way, I'll be all too happy to say it loud, clear, and in detail in the second part of this analysis.